Earlier this year, the NZCER and the National Centre collaborated on a series of workshops that were run throughout the country called the Roadshow series. This series was designed to inform people around the TEC assessments tool. The Roadshow series is broken into 4 components, and this is a brief presentation of the content that was included in Workshop 3. I'm going to talk through each of the 3 learning outcomes that were part of the course, and if you'd like more information on any of these, please contact the National Centre and I'll have their website up at the end of this presentation. The intended outcomes were to improve the use of the assessment tool for informing teaching and learning, developing group learning plans with specific outcomes, and developing individual learning plans. At the workshop, we asked people to describe how literacy and numeracy was being embedded into their particular context. And of course we get a variety of different answers that reflect the different ways people are implementing the learning progressions in the assessment tool and so on. One of the things we like to stress was that the literacy and numeracy process is a process, and it has 3 parts: knowing the demands, knowing the learner, and knowing what to do. And this model really forms the foundation of the learning progressions. And to give an example of this, we use the context of an agriculture course and a group of students who are required to mix up weed killer. The weed killer instructions were quite complex, included a ratio of weed killer to water, and some of the students were struggling with this particular task. If we applied a literacy and numeracy process to this, we could maybe smooth out some of these issues a little bit. Knowing the demands, for example, if we started there, we could analyse the instructions on the weed killer pamphlet, and we could work out what kind of vocabulary was required, what kind of reading skills were required, comprehension and so on. We could also analyse the numeracy demands. What sort of ratio knowledge was required? Do people know that know information around millilitres, litres and so on? If we map the demands, we might say that the demands for this particular task were at step 4 or step 5. Knowing the learner, this has been made much easier through use of the assessment tool. If our learners are sitting in assessment, we can see very quickly that perhaps they are going to struggle with a particular task, and we can see where we might need to scaffold some help. In the case of the demands being analysed and sitting somewhere around step 4 or step 5, if we assess a learner who's at step 3, we can see that they might struggle with this task. And this informs what we do. So we know that just putting them into this task and asking them to do it by themselves is likely to cause some difficulty for them. So we can make sure we scaffold that activity. So when we ask them to follow the instructions, we could do a brief lesson on the instructions, analyse some of the vocabulary, analyse some of the underpinning numeracy demands, and make sure that this is a positive learning experience. So in essence, one of the things we stressed during the course was that the literacy and numeracy process is designed to cultivate success. The second questions we asked people were, what assessments are they currently using in their practice? And this relates to the TEC assessment tool. Most people reported back that they were using some combination of snapshot assessments or full adaptive, generally the reading and numeracy, and sometimes the writing as well. And then follow-up questions were, how do you analyse the results? How do you use the assessment results? And these are tougher questions and really get to the heart of how the assessment tool is being used in some cases. I'm going to talk through a real example that was used that I was part of, and during this example I'm going to discuss how each of these components, knowing the demands, knowing the learner and knowing what to do, worked, and how eventually we developed group learning plans and further into more details based on the assessment tool. So I'm going to discuss knowing the demands, knowing the learner and knowing what to do in the context of a retail course. Now my involvement in the retail course was, I was fortunate enough to be involved in a workplace literacy course with this particular store, and I was also working with a retail course at level 1 and level 2. Now this was an upmarket clothing store in the Waikato, and of course the first thing we did is went in and we wanted to map the demands, look at what kind of tasks were required by an employee to really thrive within this environment. What do they need to be able to talk with customers appropriately, to meet all the numeracy demands, the writing demands and the reading demands, and to make sure that this was a really positive experience for them and for the manager as well. So just as an example, for numeracy, there were some specific tasks. Answer customer queries regarding discounted prices. Enter correct amounts into the electronic till and check the reasonableness of the total. And collect and count cash from customers and return the correct amount. Now, the very first one, answer customer queries regarding discounted prices, was something that the manager was fairly keen on, and this involved working out mentally particular calculations. So this is the example I'd like to use as we move forward. Let me give you an example. Employees were expected to work out these kinds of things and be able to tell the customer what the price of a particular item was. So for example, we might have a rack with 20% off, we might have a rack with 15% off, and we might have a rack with 30% off, and all different prices. Now, it was the manager's expectation that her employees would be able to work these out in their head, and the perception was that if a customer asks how much an item costs, this calculation should be able to be done mentally and responded to. In the workshop, we asked people to work out these particular questions and to really analyse their own strategies around how they did it. So what will the following items cost? A 30% dress with a 15% discount, an $30 dress with a 15% discount, an $80 jacket, 20% discount, and a $140 dress with a 30% discount. And the idea was that these reflected the tasks that the employees would be expected to do. Now, when we asked participants in the workshop to tell us how they worked these out, there were a variety of different responses. 15% off a $30 dress. A lot of people worked out 10% of 30 is 3. 5% is half of that, so that's another $1.50. So we're going to remove $4.50 in total from the 30. As an alternative type of strategy, working out 20% or a 20% discount off an $80 jacket, some people realised that they were going to be paying 80%, saving 20%, so they could work out 80% of 80 simpler than working out the 20%, and that would be, in some cases, they would work out 8 times 8, 64, and they arrived at 64. And so we've got a variety of different strategies and asked participants to talk through how they solve these problems. So knowing the demands, identifying the demands is a process of determining what underpinning skills and knowledge are required to complete a task. So that's what we did. We thought about what are the kinds of skills that people need to be able to solve these discount problems. And secondly, determining the required expertise of those skills and knowledge on the learning progressions. So two things. What are the skills needed? And what level do those skills need to be at to be able to competently perform these tasks in the workplace? In the workshop, of course, we asked people to map these tasks. There were a variety of responses, and generally we agreed that, seeing as we were using percentages, that put us at step 6 on the strategy side of the make sense of number chart strand, and step 5 on the knowledge. So really quite high level skills to be able to work those calculations out mentally. When we assessed learners, many of them were at step 3. And so now we've adequately mapped our demands at step 6-5, and we've also assessed learners, and we can see they're at step 3. Part of this process, of course, is moving learners forward. If learners are at step 3 and the learning progressions being a learning trajectory or a hypothetical trajectory of how learners learn, we want to progress them from step 3 to step 6, and you can see this is a big task. and we had lots of discussions about how people would go about it, whether it was feasible, and so on. When we had a look at what step 3 represents, we just took a snapshot example from the multiplicative strategies progression, and we can see that our learner who's assessed at step 3 is able to do some single digit multiplication, 6 times 5. They might know this off by heart, or they might get to this answer by repeated addition, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 and so on. 8 times 4, perhaps they know this off by heart as well. And when we look at where we need them to be be able to calculate 15% of 80, for example, we can see that this is pretty much at step 6, solve multiplication or division problems with decimals, fractions and percentages using partitioning strategies. And in the workshop we've talked a fair bit about partitioning strategies, how they worked and so on. The main thing here is you can see there's a discrepancy between the current skills of the learners and what skills they're going to need in the workplace. Group plans and learning sequences. So now that we've mapped our demands and we've assessed our learners, we know our learners are going to struggle with some of the tasks in the workplace. The question now is to create a strategy, a plan, a strategy, and develop some great learning opportunities for students that are going to really help bridge these gaps. It's quite a simple formulaic way of doing this. And this is not a how-to, but this is rather food for thought. One of the ways is simply to pluck the phrases from the learning progressions. An action word, solve, identify the literacy and numeracy skills, and define the course content area. So for example, our outcome may have been solve multiplication problems with percentages using partitioning strategies, relating to identifying the sale price of discounted items. And this became one of our primary outcomes that we wanted for this course, for numeracy. We wanted students to be able to work out discounted prices mentally. When we wrote this into a plan, you can see that we have our outcome at the top. Solve multiplication problems with percentages using partitioning strategies relating to identifying the sale price of discounted items. And of course we wouldn't write this always in such a broken up way, but it suits the purpose here. And then we have 3 particular strategies that we're going to implement to make sure that students are able to do these skills, or to make sure that we're at least moving them towards. We're going to plan it and we're going to sequence these. The first thing we were going to do is discuss and apply a range of strategies to solve a discount problem. I should say we did do this and it was successful. And in the workshop we covered each of these activities as well. The second thing was to partition numbers and recombine to multiply multi-digit numbers with single digits. And we used a post-it game to do this. And third, mentally partition and recombine double-digit multiplication sums. And to do this we used discount pamphlets. And I'll talk a little bit later on exactly how we did this in the course. But for now, you can see that we've clearly identified our outcome. And we also have 3 particular strategies that we're going to implement to try and achieve these things. Just to give you another example of how this might work, another course I was involved in had to do with some employees working in inwards goods. And as part of their job they were required to take pallets off trucks and compare the packing slip quantities with the actual quantities on the pallet. And as you can see, this is an example of a fairly typical example. There's a certain amount of green overalls on the pallet and there's a certain amount of blue overalls. There's a packing slip that tells us how much of each there is. And they were required to work these out pretty quickly to see if they match. Where they didn't match, they would then not sign the form, and the truck driver would be required to check where the missing stock was and so on. Following the literacy and numeracy process, the first thing we do is we look at the demands. What are the demands of this particular task? What do people need to be able to do? What skills and knowledge to be able to work these kind of things out? This particular task we mapped step 5, and that is students generally, or employees in this case, needed to be able to multiply sums very quickly in their head. So it was a combination of number knowledge or number facts, and also multiplicative skills and additive skills as well. We wrote it into an outcome. We wanted learners to be able to solve multi-digit multiplication problems relating to counting stock and inwards goods. So again, we've prioritized our outcome, and we've clearly written what we want. And then we've implemented a plan. We have 3 strategies that we're going to use to get them there. We're going to discuss and apply a range of strategies to solve a multiplication problem. And then after this, and this might take a few weeks for that first one. The second one, partition numbers and recombine to multiply multi-digit numbers with single digits. The post-it activity again. And mentally partition and recombine double-digit multiplication sums. And this is using actual pallets and boxes, and trying to model the actual environment and tasks as close as possible. In the workshop, we went through the exact example and we looked at how this worked. Just to give you some other examples of writing a learning plan, here's another one we used for the same retail course I was talking about earlier. As a part of the task, when we looked at the reading tasks, they had to read information pamphlets about new products and so on. And so we wanted them to apply comprehension strategies to locate, organise and summarise information relating to product information pamphlets. And you can see that applying comprehension strategies to locate, organise and summarise is one of the key statements taken directly from the comprehension progression. Sitting at step 5, and then we implement our plan to make sure people can do this. Discuss and apply a range of comprehension strategies to product pamphlets. So in this case, discussing what comprehension strategies are and sort of making a tally of what these are and what we could use. That's step 1. Step 2, use text features to identify main points. This is to do with understanding that there's headings and subheadings and so on. And finally, categorizing and summarizing key information in the text. And so we want students, when they're working in this particular store, if that's where they're going, to be able to read pamphlets quickly, identify the main points, know how to read them, and to be able to organize and summarize that information correctly. Another example, to calculate and convert between fractions, decimals and percentages relating to a clothing retail environment. And again, you can see that we have our 3 strategies there. Now these 3 strategies, what makes them different from just a series of activities is that they're carefully aligned with where the learners are achieving on the assessment tool. So approach number 1 there, recognizing and linking common fractions to common decimals and percentages, really is beginning to reflect students who are beginning to get an initial understanding of the relationship between decimals and percentages and so on. And we're using things like a string line and so on to draw out what they already know and then to build on that. Number 2, understanding the unit values of decimals and percentages is taking that a step further and further developing understanding around how each of these number systems works. And finally, we're going to apply these things in a practical way. We're going to practice solving discounted prices of items on special and so on. For the retail course, we had 7 specific outcomes that we were after, and these are our high priority outcomes. There were 2 for numeracy, 2 for reading, 1 for writing, and speaking and listening, of course, was a priority in terms of customer relationships and customer service. So we clearly articulated each of the outcomes we wanted in terms of an outcome statement. And then we carefully designed our strategies to make sure we were developing these skills based on where they were at current skill level as identified on the assessment tool. Now I think 7 to 8, 6 to 8 say learning outcomes is appropriate for a course. These are the high priority outcomes, and these are identified by thinking about what are the skills that somebody needs to be able to be competent and do really well in a particular vocation. So I know we've talked lots about mapping course content, but it's a great idea to think about when somebody leaves your organisation, what skills do they need to be able to thrive in the vocation you're training them for. It might be high customer service, it might be great note taking, it might be being able to read information and assimilate it quickly. It might be being able to keep up with the numeracy demands of the job as they increase over time. So it's really worth thinking about a graduate profile, so to speak. What would you like your students to be able to do when they leave your course? And then prioritise what those things are and then frame them as an outcome. Now, we're not saying that everybody has to meet these outcomes, but there's a plan in place and we're working towards them. The model I just showed you is a convenient model and useful. Lots of people have taken it or have slightly different approaches, and that's fine. This is just one way to do it. What is important is to clearly articulate what the outcome is you're after, make sure it's high priority, and then clearly implement a plan to get there. Now, just one more thing. Once these demands have been identified and clearly planned, they can exist as part of the package of the course. They don't need to be rewritten constantly. It would be great if they were a living document, but just for example, imagine if a new tutor came into a course, these priorities, these outcomes would already be written for the tutor. They could look at them and they could know that these are the priorities for this course, the literacy and numeracy priorities. This is what I'm going to be working towards, and here are some strategies to achieving these. And this is part of knowledge management and making sure that the documentation is in place as well. So the strategies that were used at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, are taken from these books. We've got 3 numeracy books which are fantastic and are probably an underused resource. Each of these books has a table that aligns particular activities and strategies with particular steps. To give you an example, teaching adults to make sense of number to solve problems. You can see that there's a graph in the book that clearly identifies activities and strategies that are going to be appropriate for particular learners. So if we have learners who are presenting at step 3 on the learning progressions, you have activities there that are immediately appropriate. If I have learners that are at step 3 or presenting at step 3 on the assessment tool, then generally I start with strategies aimed at step 3, just to get them off on the right foot and make sure that they're succeeding in everything they do, building confidence, and then slowly progress towards step 4 and step 5. And the idea here is that you're not just lumping step 5 activities onto learners who perhaps don't have those skills yet, but you're carefully scaffolding it. The same can be said with the knowledge part of the strand. If we put these 2 pages together, we can get an idea of strategies that are appropriate for learners. So for example, learners who are requiring to move up to step 4, we have a broad array here of activities that are appropriate. And these are not just one-off activities. For example, in the workshop we demonstrated how an activity could run over a series of weeks. Multiplication strategies, for example, at page 39. It's a great activity, great strategies there that can be used repetitively throughout a series of weeks to really develop those skills. And in my experience, I've found small doses are certainly better than big one-shot classes, but just little bits dropped throughout the day can really be highly effective in terms of developing those skills. So just to sum up, knowing the demands is probably the most neglected part of the embedded literacy and numeracy process, and yet it's vital. Knowing the demands is a matter of analysing the demands of your particular course, but also the vocation that you're training students for. If you're training students to work in hospitality, there's a set of skills there that they're going to need: great customer service skills, they're going to need good note-taking skills, cash handling skills, and those skills are going to be unique to that particular environment. If you're training students for automotive engineering, the demands might have a slightly different shape to them. But the idea is you need to know exactly what students need to be able to do in the vocation they're going to. Second, knowing the learner, and this is where the assessment tool is so effective. You can get an idea immediately of where the learner sits and the types of skills that need to be developed for them to be competent in the vocation they're going to. And finally, knowing what to do. Probably the most enjoyable part of this process, but knowing what to do, highly targeted and very specific strategies that meet the needs of the student, and make sure that the student is succeeding. So they're not always being thrown in over the head in tasks that they struggle with, but that they're carefully scaffolded and appropriate for their level. If you'd like more information on this, you can go straight to the website, literacyandnumeracyforadults.com, and there are a host of resources on that website that you could get, or you could contact the National Centre and see about getting some more information on anything that's been covered in this presentation. Thanks very much.